Fit Strong Women Over 50 podcast, episode 62. Welcome to the Becoming Ellie Community Podcast. I'm Jill.
And I'm Chris. We named the community for our podcast Becoming Ellie because Ellie is the Norse goddess of aging. And when she was challenged to a wrestling match with Thor, she surprised everyone by winning.
Yeah. So we decided we wanted to be fit and strong as we age, like Ellie. And while we all want to be fit and strong, we are still working on becoming fit and strong.
Yeah, getting fit and strong is always a challenge for me.
Today's guest will help us meet that challenge. We're speaking with Jess Elliott, and she gives us lots of ways to be fit and strong.
I think our listeners are going to enjoy this episode a lot. Let's get started.
Today's guest is Jess Elliott, owner of Tag Performance, a sports performance coaching and education company. Jess is an affiliate faculty member at the Metropolitan State University of Denver in the Department of Human Performance and is a sports performance coach with Exos.
Jess has an extensive coaching background in strength and conditioning, working with athletes of all ages and backgrounds, from high school students to professional athletes.
Jess holds a bachelor's degree in human performance in sports from the Metropolitan State University of Denver, a master's degree in sports coaching from the University of North Colorado. Welcome, Jess. We're so glad you could be with us today.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
I wanted to start by asking, I know your mission is to equip and empower others to live their best lives. Perhaps we'll start with a description of what that means to you. Do you coach trainers as well as athletes? And what services does Tag Performance provide?
Really, I kind of wanted to take a much more zoomed out kind of view when preparing the mission statement for my company, because to me, what it really does come down to is equipping and empowering others to live their best lives. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we can do that through the performance model. At Exos, we kind of divide it into 4 different pillars. We have movement, mindset, recovery, and nutrition. One of the biggest things with my company is that I take a very holistic approach. So I didn't want my mission to just focus on the performance variables, in a sense, like strength and conditioning and movement. So I didn't want to be so exclusive that we're forgetting to look at people as a whole. And yes, primarily I work with athletes and coaches. If I can share my knowledge with coaches who can then take that knowledge and then help all of their athletes, it just allows me to help and impact more people all at once.
So if I were a triathlete and I had hired a coach and that coach wanted to make sure that I got some extra or more information about strength and conditioning, they might use one of your plans to supplement their own coaching.
Yes, exactly. In addition to the individual programming that I do, I have enough bandwidth to take on, a few athletes at a time and work with them individually. But one of the biggest asks that I had from coaches was, do you have programs for sale that we can implement with our athletes? Yes, they want that information, but they as well don't necessarily have that bandwidth. So if they had programs available that they can trust, that's something that they can just kind of take and run with. So yes, I'm very excited that this year I now have programs available. They're on the Training Peak store, and also you can get them on my website as well. But it's something where athletes can purchase them for themselves, but also coaches can purchase them. They only need to buy them once, and they can use them with all of their athletes.
Oh, very nice. So you have some very impressive credentials. You're a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a tactical strength and conditioning facilitator and an Exos performance specialist. Tell us what that means in terms of like extreme fitness, and maybe we could just back up and you could tell us what an Exos performance specialist is.
Sure. To start with, I'll kind of explain some of the credentials. the CSCS, Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist. That's kind of the standard for all strength and conditioning coaches across the nation. The NSCA also offers a tactical strength and conditioning certification, and I completed that while I was working with the fire service. And then the Exos Performance Specialist, this is something that I've done. It's part of Exos, the other company that I work for. Instead of just being regional, we actually do a lot of workshops. Strength and conditioning certifications deal more towards the physics, the science of sport performance. And we call it kind of the difference between exercise science and sport science. So really diving into a lot of those performance variables that help elite athletes.
I know that you help to bridge the gap between endurance and adventure communities. What's the difference between these two groups, and how do you help to create that bridge?
In Colorado, there probably isn't that much of a difference, to be honest. Especially, I kind of am based in Boulder, Colorado, which is like the mecca for kind of endurance sports.
Yes.
It's really funny. I was very excited. I got into trail running last year. I was like, oh yeah, I feel like I could do like a half marathon distance this year, maybe go for like a full. And it's funny because in Boulder, that's not enough. They're like, oh, you need to do like a 50-mile. You need to do 100-mile races. And so Boulder definitely takes adventure and endurance to the extreme. But I think for me, when I got into strength and conditioning, I kind of was a little bit of an oddball. You can't see me because there's no video, but I'm like this 5'3" petite, Asian woman. And I definitely was not the typical strength and conditioning coach profile that you would see. A lot of people in our field are like former football players or, they're collegiate athletes, which I could have been a collegiate athlete, but it would have been for tennis. And so I grew up playing tennis. I grew up as a competitive dancer, grew up skiing, climbing, all sorts of things. More on that adventure sport spectrum, which in Colorado is what we're really known for. And for me as a coach, I knew that I was passionate about movement, that I loved helping people. I feel like an engineer of movement in a sense. So I really love it. But I also felt like my place would not be maybe the traditional strength and conditioning route. And so what I really wanted to do was find kind of the niche that really fit me culturally, and where I felt like I could have the most impact. And it was very serendipitous how I fell into the endurance and kind of the whole adventure sport community. I think really it's just, I've started working, kind of in the traditional path with high school, then college. I started working with Division I collegiate athletics, and I loved it, but it wasn't necessarily like true to who I was. And so I felt very fortunate when I had the opportunity to kind of bridge the gap and start working with endurance athletes. And what's interesting is the endurance population really doesn't have a lot of the resources and information about strength and conditioning that traditional power or team sports have,
Right.
Like with football, strength and conditioning is kind of just, old hat at this point,
Right, it's what you do.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a given. Exactly. Right.
And it's something that's ingrained into athletes, even, at this day and age, starting in high school. And even now, high school athletes have access to resources that when I was a high school athlete and a tennis player, I certainly didn't have access to.
Sure.
And so I think for me, it was about bridging that gap and saying, hey, you know what? Endurance athletes, they need strength and conditioning resources too. Like they are equally impressive athletes. They absolutely need this knowledge. If anything, their sport, it's a lifelong sport. It's not just something that you're doing for, 3 years or so post-college, maybe 10 years. This is, endurance sports are very much lifelong sports. And so we start looking more at the long-term athletic development model and how to preserve movement quality, health, and wellness throughout an entire lifetime. And so I felt very connected, very passionate about that. And naturally, like I said, the endurance sport and adventure community are very, I don't want to say synonymous, but they're kind of one and the same. People that cycle, that run, that are triathletes, they hike, they mountain bike, they're out in the wilderness, they ski, they're very, very active year round. And so they kind of naturally go together. But the common thread that I found is that both of those fields really didn't have exposure to the strength and conditioning resources as maybe traditional team sports. And so that was the gap that I really wanted to bridge, was saying, hey, you know what? these athletes absolutely need, want, and deserve the latest information, strength and conditioning. How can I fill that void? How can I offer my knowledge and my services to them?
Excellent. Excellent.
Maybe before we go into a little bit more detail about that, you could tell us about your adventures above the tree line and how you adventure to alpine lakes.
Oh my goodness. It's kind of this, it's kind of an addiction. I just, a lot of people in Colorado, they're chasing 14ers and peaks. And I mean, the views are stunning, but maybe this is just me and I might get some haters from this, but when you're hiking 14ers, I mean, you have to wake up at like 1, 2, 3 in the morning, drive to a trailhead. You're potentially napping for a little bit in your car, which I do anyway in the summer, which I'll talk about. But, you get up super early just to get parking, and you have to start so early because the treks are so long and the climbs are really steep. And at the top, it's usually so cold and windy and it's rocky, and it's just, you lose a lot of the scenery in a sense. Like the view from the top is great, but it's kind of more that like 30,000 foot view. It's not necessarily like the terrain you're climbing is particularly picturesque. And yeah, it's very windy. So what's funny is that at a lot of the peaks, you'll see these little rock forts that are created as like little wind shelters almost, so that you can sit and rest and kind of eat with a little bit of protection on all sides. So, I mean, the forts are kind of cool and fun, but aside from that, it's not as pleasurable for me personally as, waking up maybe a little less early, maybe like 4 or 5 a.m., getting a few extra hours. But I really love the landscape above tree line. Alpine meadows, right now we're hitting the start of wildflower season. So you just see all of these different colors popping up. And I've started to become a very amateur landscape photographer. And by amateur, I mean I use my iPhone 11 for all photos. I actually have a camera that I have no idea how to use. But I love seeing all of the colors. And it's amazing how the views just open up once you're really above the tree line. And I love destination hiking. I love feeling like not only have I achieved something kind of at the end, but I like feeling like I've earned the views that are in front of me. And so I really love hiking to alpine lakes. And the waters are so blue, and it has to do with the glacial sediment. That's what makes them kind of that crisp blue color. And so it's beautiful. I love that it's something that's high up there and it's not just accessible to anybody. You really have to work to see it. So for me, it's just an all around thrilling and satisfying experience.
Great. If one of us wanted to take up adventuring, how would we do it, or where would we go for help?
Oh, that's a good question. Gosh, I think it kind of depends on what sort of adventuring you're looking to do. It's a very relative term. For me, it's kind of those adventures above tree line. I love the metaphor of the tree line and kind of it symbolizing my comfort zone in a sense. One of my favorite quotes is life begins outside your comfort zone. And I love the idea of the metaphor of life beginning kind of just above the tree line, for me at least, of saying, you know what, so much life exists outside of my comfort zone. So it's kind of this constant reminder for me to push myself. But that doesn't mean that everybody needs to adventure, above 10,000 feet above the tree line. It can just be somewhere within your local landscape. It could be in your backyard, so I think it's very relative. But as far as hiking, I did have some people ask me some questions about, how to get into hiking. It's definitely not something that, you go from 0 to climbing 14ers necessarily all in one night. So I created some articles on my personal blog. So it's a different website about like early hiking season tips, kind of how to start training for hikes. But really, if you're looking to adventure, it's kind of the same thing as taking on any sport or the same kind of principles that we use in strength and conditioning. So it has to do with progressive overload. You always want to be continually challenging the body. You still want to make sure you're resting and recovering, but it's really just about slowly pushing yourself a little bit further each time, however that looks for you. Maybe it's adding on a quarter mile. Maybe it's adding on a mile to each of your hikes. Maybe it's increasing the elevation gain. Maybe it's increasing the amount of time that you're hiking for, or maybe it's running or walking. So yeah, really, it's just about pushing your limits a little bit more each time and giving your body time to rest and recover in between.
Yeah, that kind of leads right into my next question because, well, as you know, the audience is primarily women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s who are working on being fit and strong.
Yes.
Many in our group are endurance athletes. But some of us are in the middle here. And so what advice would you give those of us who want to take our fitness to the next level?
It's so difficult to kind of nail down one thing. I feel like the first thing that I want to identify is just the fact that it's possible. I really want that to maybe hit home with people, is that I think at times we think that we've hit a limit, or we think that certain goals are out of reach. And that's not the case. I mean, do we all have like our own potential genetic cap somewhere? Yes. And most of us probably are not going to come close to that unless we really want to push and kind of be uncomfortable. And that's great if you do. But I think for me, first and foremost, it's just acknowledging that it's possible. No matter what your age, no matter what your starting point is, it's always possible. And so I really want people to feel empowered by that. Like, it's not too late to get started, and there is room for growth, and it's never too late to perform better, because like I said, it's not just about sports performance. It's about long-term athletic development. And as we get older, it's about maintaining quality of life. And so I think that's kind of the first thing to acknowledge, is that there is always room for improvement, and it's never too late. From there, kind of like I said, I mean, really when you're stripping down all of the principles of strength and conditioning, it really comes to progressive overload. You need to stimulate the body enough to facilitate what we call adaptation, but you also need to rest and recover. I think a lot of times in endurance sports, we get this idea that more is always better. And so we feel guilty in a sense, or we feel unproductive if we take a day to rest. And one of the interesting things that I think a lot of people fail to understand is that the time that we rest is actually when our body recovers, and that's where all of the adaptations occur. And so we actually need that time. We need our sleep. We need our recovery. We need that downtime for our body to actually recover from the stimulus that we've provided, and to actually gain the adaptations that we've been chasing and promoting. So I think that's kind of what it boils down to for me is, it's steady incremental progression and overload to the body. You want to change it up, but really it's just about stimulus. You need to push yourself outside that comfort zone, because the body wants to maintain homeostasis. It likes being in its happy place. So you really need to make sure that you have enough stimulation to promote adaptation. So I think a lot of times endurance athletes, they do a lot of body weight, calisthenic type exercises, which are great. But I think we constantly have to keep in mind, okay, am I continually progressing? Am I continually stimulating and overloading my body from its current point enough to facilitate adaptation? And you can do that with body weight exercises. But I think sometimes people get so into a routine, at least that's what I've seen in the endurance community, is they kind of have like their set workout routine. It's mostly body weight or very low weight stuff that they can kind of do at home. And then they don't change it very much over the course of months or even potentially a year. And so they've plateaued. They've reached the point that we call accommodation. I would also term that stagnation, where your body's adapted to it. It's reached homeostasis, and it's happy to stay there. You have to continue to push yourself outside of your comfort zone, not just in your sport, but also when it comes to strength and conditioning training as well, if you want to continue to see adaptation.
Which is where what you even said about taking up hiking, you have to continually increase what you're doing, whether it's by doing more or lifting more, heavier. So instead of just doing body weights, adding some kind of weight to it.
Sure.
Okay.
And even if you have, maybe right now you only have kind of what's available in your home. And for a lot of people, calisthenic training is a great option, but we can play around with tempo training. So that refers to time under tension. For example, we take a push-up. Most people, they go down and hopefully they come back up.
Right.
But one of the other variables that we can play around with is that time that the muscle's under tension. So playing around with tempo, maybe it's on the lowering phase. Maybe instead of just kind of going down and back up at a steady pace, maybe we increase the amount of time that we're spending going down. Maybe we extend that over a 3 or 5 or 6 counts. Maybe we add a pause at the bottom for a given amount of time. And so it's playing around with things like that can also help us continue to progress a movement and overload the body while still working with minimal equipment. So I don't want people to feel like they have to get into the gym or they have to do weights if that's something that they don't have available to them. There are other ways that we can overload the body.
Okay. I watched a recent video from your website about your view of strength and conditioning, and that you mentioned that you want to start with having someone move well before you worry about specific exercises. Can you tell us about that? What does that mean?
That's funny that you found that. So it came about because a lot of the questions that I get are like, what's the best movement, that I can do? Or if I only have like a few minutes to train, like, what's the most bang for my buck? Like, what should I be doing? Like, what?
We love to ask that question.
I know. I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, that's one of our typical questions.
And
I don't think we're going to ask that to you today.
and it's not meant to say that those aren't valid or beneficial questions, but I think for me, it was really about reframing that lens through which we're looking at it, because we don't really want to boil it down to a single movement, because for some people, like one of my favorite movements is the deadlift. We actually tend to have this fun debate in strength and conditioning where we kind of debate what our favorite movement is. And for most coaches, it usually comes down to squatting versus deadlifting. But what's interesting is that there are some people that like deadlifting with a straight barbell because of their genetic setup, because of their proportions, like of their torso to femur. Deadlifting with a straight bar just is not a mechanically sound position for them. It's not to say that
posture, is that what you mean? Their body sizes, like too tall, too short.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Sure. So if you kind of think about setting up, and I feel like I would have to follow this up with like a visual. If you're looking from the side in a traditional straight bar deadlift position from the side, the shoulders should be in front of the bar, but you want relatively I'm looking at kind of the torso to femur, like length ratio. And There are people, and this actually is kind of funny because I can relate this to a story where I was getting a mountain bike, and I don't like the mountain bikes for women. The colors tend to be very girly. Same thing with skis. I always liked the men's skis better. But what was funny was that I was going in and getting a bike, and one of the fitters kind of looked at me and he said, "Oh," he's like, "I know why a women's bike doesn't fit you." And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure. Please tell me." And he was like, "Well, cause you're built more like a man." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's what every woman wants to hear. So thank you for that."
So your femurs are longer than your torso?
Actually, I'm the reverse. So traditionally speaking, and this is not always the case. I've known men to have this and women to have this. But in general, the stereotype is that women tend to have shorter torsos and longer legs. Whereas for me, if you actually look at kind of my ratios, I have a longer torso and kind of shorter legs. And
that's how I'm built too.
Yeah.
Short legs, like a dachshund. I always say I'm like a dachshund. Long body, short legs.
Yeah, that's me. And so, what's interesting is like you look at sprinters. Sprinters tend to have longer femurs and then shorter lower leg ratios. And that kind of facilitates a lot of explosive power from the hip with the femur, but then it enables a lot of turnover with the lower leg. So really, genetically speaking, people's body types do kind of predispose them to be better at certain sports and activities. So that's absolutely true. But when I think about putting athletes under the bar for squatting or for deadlifting, there are a lot of athletes who, if they back squat, they feel like they're falling backwards. And yes, you can argue that that's technique, but for some people, it absolutely is the case that at the bottom of the squat position, when you look at their torso to femur, instead of their shoulders kind of in the bottom of a squat position, if you're holding it, instead of the shoulders being stacked kind of and in line with the knees, you'll see that their shoulders are actually further back quite significantly, several inches. And so really their torso is not as long as their femurs. And so they can't counterbalance in that position. And then you put a barbell on their back and it further pulls them backwards. And that's why they feel like they're falling over. And so it has nothing to do with their technique, and it has everything to do with just their proportions and their ratios between their torso and their femurs.
So if there was someone like that, would you just say maybe you should do a front squat instead of a back squat? Or would you say maybe you shouldn't be doing squats?
I mean, it definitely depends. And that's kind of why I steer away from the exercise specifically.
Okay.
Because I think that's how a lot of people see strength and conditioning is it's what exercise should I do? Okay. If I can't back squat, should I front squat? And really the point I was trying to get across is as a strength and conditioning coach, I zoom out even further than that because I'm trying to think about, okay, what does this athlete need? But also too, what is their goal? You know, what are they trying to accomplish? What is the performance variable that we're really trying to manipulate to give them a competitive edge or to make them healthier, more balanced, less injury prone? And then I kind of reverse engineer it from there. So really thinking about movements only and the exercise, it's too simplistic. It's a little bit too zoomed in. So really I'm thinking more about, okay, if I have an athlete, how are they moving? You know, what does their squat even look like? And so I'm trying to train human movement and movement quality, because if you can move well on the ground, if you can move well in a multi-planar fashion, so in all three planes, if you can generate force, but you also know how to absorb force properly with your body, that's going to transfer exponentially to your sport. So it's really about, for me, looking at the variables of strength and conditioning that really contribute to human performance and injury prevention, rather than zooming in so much that we're kind of ignoring all of those things and just thinking about what exercise should I be doing.
It sounds like your strength and movement training is great. You really know about go, 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 push, push, push. But what about the strategies to bring your body back into neutral? And I know you talked a little bit about mastering recovery, but I saw a quote on your Instagram. The spaces in between the stimuli and stressors are where our bodies adapt and transform. So how do you suggest your athletes recover? Do you have some top recovery strategies?
I do. That's a wonderful question. I think it's important to address the body in a very holistic way when talking about recovery. So it's not just about physical recovery, but it is also about kind of that psychological recovery. There's kind of this overall wellness concept as well, where it's not just about resting to allow the muscles time and soft tissue and maybe even bone, etc. But, you know, we have to think about what are the hormones of the body doing? You know, the body doesn't differentiate between stress. And so whether it's stress from a long ride or a long run, whether it's stress because you're moving, whether it's stress because you've gotten laid off, or maybe you're having some disagreements with your partner or your children, or you're in school and you're stressed, or you went on vacation and you have a sunburn all over your body, or it's allergy season. You know, all of these are different stressors that your body has to respond to. So if you think about it, your body only has so much currency at a given time to work with. And the more that you're asking your body to do, the more stress, cumulative stress that you're responding to, it's going to take longer for your body to adapt and recover from any one particular thing. And so when we think about recovery, I really want people to look at their life overall and say, okay, where's my body's attention going? You know, do I have a lot of stress in one particular area? How can I minimize that? So one of the things that I teach a lot of my students, first and foremost, and I've gotten rave reviews about this. This is like their favorite thing. It makes me think I could hold class in one day and just call it the end of the semester. But they love what's called recovery position. And so with recovery position, this is something I learned about kind of a few years back during my time working with the fire service, because in a tactical field, your sympathetic nervous system, you're kind of constantly going into that fight or flight. And really,
Sure.
even in American society, our culture is kind of one that's always go, go, go. It's not really a culture of rest and repose. It's kind of, always do more, like be the superwoman, be the super mom who can be fit and have a great job, but who's also an incredible mother and an incredible partner and who can do all of these things. So it's always about kind of being able to do your best at multiple things. And that's very tiring. That requires a lot out of us. You're always on, you're always performing. And so with recovery position, it's about shifting back from that sympathetic drive and trying to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that rest and repose, feed and breathe, rest and digest system. And so one of the problems that we have is that when we're triggering ourselves by going into that sympathetic overdrive and we're stimulating that fight or flight response over and over again, we can actually get trapped in there, which can then drain your adrenals. It can cause complete devastation to your endocrine system, which can then cause a lot of other, spiraling health effects. And so to counteract that, I put my athletes in recovery position. So we'll have their feet kind of up against a wall. They're laying flat on their backs on the ground, legs up on a wall. And I'll implement a variety of different breathing techniques. But the idea being that, one, we want to train diaphragmatic breathing, so kind of belly breathing. A lot of people, when they breathe, it's kind of more into the shoulders, so the upper area of their lungs. As runners, you kind of know that nasty side stitch that you get when you're not belly breathing. So
I'm familiar with that stitch.
It's early season. I'm definitely getting a lot of those. Yeah, it's a good place to practice that belly breathing so that we're really filling air into our lungs, into the deepest spaces. And then by adding in kind of a tempo and a rhythm to our breathing, we can actually trigger a valgus response, which is what triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. So interesting tidbit. So I used to work as a medic in emergency medicine. And so if you hold your breath, you can actually drop your heart rate.
If you hold your breath.
Yes. So it's kind of this funny joke that we would have when I was working in EMS, that you often find people like passed out on the toilet, like they fainted. And a lot of that's because they're bearing down so hard that they overstimulate their vagal nerve, and then they end up, fainting and passing out. And
wow.
So it's that same idea though, is that your exhale when you're breathing. So usually I'll do an inhale. So belly breathing for 4 counts. I have their hands on their belly so that they can actually feel that the air is moving into the right places. So they'll inhale for 4 counts. Sometimes I add in a pause, sometimes not. I personally don't necessarily like it. But then I'll do a longer exhale than an inhale.
Like an 8 count?
Yeah.
An 8 count out? Yes. So I've heard of that kind of breathing.
Exactly. So that 6 to 8 count. So by doing that, by really controlling our breath and extending the exhale, that's what stimulates the vagal nerve response and shifts us more into that parasympathetic nervous system. And so it calms us down. And so if you're very worked up, if you're very stressed, if you're very anxious, this is something that I teach not just for lifestyle. Maybe you just did, a ton of sprints out on the track, or you just did strides. Let's have you finish up in recovery position, the legs up. It helps increase circulation from the legs back to the core. So it helps kind of use gravity to shuttle the blood back to the core. So it makes it easier for the body, essentially. But then working on those breathing techniques to really calm the body back down. And so it works not just with physical performance, but also if you're feeling particularly stressed or anxious. I do a lot of visualization work with a lot of my athletes and students kind of while they're in recovery position. We'll do a lot of positive psychology work, a lot of mindfulness training to combine that with recovery position. And one of the things that people have found is that they then start implementing it on their own. And it's a nice little kind of just daily snack for themselves. It's nice to make space for yourself to just feel whatever you're feeling. Use the breath to help kind of pull in whatever energy, whatever feelings you're kind of having. Use the exhale to release any tension that you're noticing throughout the body. So it's really meant to be this holistic recovery position in a sense.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So that's like step 1, and it seems to be a huge hit. That tends to be, I do surveys with my students at the beginning of the semester throughout, and that's like hands down one of their favorite things that they learn. But in addition to that, I think that's a really good strategy for mental stress immediately post-workout. Nutrition is very important, and that is going to fluctuate. So as an endurance athlete, your diet's going to be a little bit different than maybe a team sport or a power sport athlete, and your fueling strategy is going to be a little different as well. But your post-workout nutrition matters equally, and it's going to be a slightly different strategy. So you want to make sure you're getting more protein in following a solid workout to make sure that you're actually giving your body what it needs to refuel and replenish. Staying hydrated, which we know is very important, but sleep. I think sleep is also one of the most underrated things, because a lot of endurance athletes, we're older in life, people are married, they have kids, they have full-time jobs, they have so much to do. And then they're trying to get out and do a sport that takes hours at a time. And so sleep is kind of something that there's only so much time in the day. And a lot of them are averaging maybe 6 hours of sleep per night. And the reality is that's just not enough time. And so it's really striving to prioritize yourself and your health to help facilitate your performance and everything else. And so I have a lot of athletes that kind of push back at that, but it's amazing how much better they feel once they start getting up closer to like 7 hours of sleep, 8 hours of sleep. So sleep definitely matters. Nutrition matters. Taking those moments to reset yourself, to calm yourself back down, to learn how to shift your nervous system response back into parasympathetic from sympathetic. All of those things really matter.
Thank you. That's great.
Sure.
So many of our races and events have been canceled, and I know people have sort of quit training for longer races or whatever. How do you recommend we keep ourselves motivated without those kinds of goals in place?
I think it's a very interesting time in this world. I've noticed that it's almost become this great chance to, I think, just explore ourselves and to take a moment to pause and to find stillness and to reevaluate. And it seems like that kind of is a common thread for everybody. So I think what's interesting about this time with races and everything being kind of scheduled, not scheduled, canceled, rescheduled, I've had a lot of athletes do a lot of introspection recently and kind of figure out, well, gosh, what really are my goals? And if I can still have maybe a little bit of a race season, how can I maybe leverage that to set me up for an even better race season next year? So of course it kind of depends on your sport, because, there are different time frames for different events. But I think it's a good chance for people to focus more on themselves in a very holistic way, falling back in love with kind of their sport, maybe finding new ways to love their sports, to fall in love with different types of movement. So in a sense, I kind of see it as an unplanned but very necessary, like active recovery period. So when we think about team sports and kind of a traditional periodization model, following the competitive season, we like to go into a phase of active recovery. But even before active recovery, a lot of times I'll kick my athletes out of the weight room and say, I don't want to see you for a couple weeks, depending on where they're at and how trashed their bodies are. Sometimes it might even be a month, because not just psychologically, but physically as well, the body takes a beating. It's hard to be a competitive athlete. And so I think there's a lot of value in taking time to just love being active. It could be in the same way as your sport. It can be in different ways. When I was working with a lot of volleyball players back in my, D1 college days, they would go kayaking. They would go stand up paddleboarding. They would get involved in yoga. They would play beach volleyball, with their friends in a very fun, recreational way, as opposed to a competitive way. So for runners, I think this is a great time to get out and just enjoy running, and maybe not running with a goal, maybe explore new types of movement. Maybe there's a different class that you want to take. I expose some of my students to animal flow, which it's kind of fun and it's interesting. It's a different way to move, but it's kind of just about experimenting with new things. And so I think this is a great time for discovery. And I think through that kind of rest and discovery, people might be able to find the answers to, where do I want to go from here? What do I want to focus on next season? Because I think sometimes if we tunnel vision in too much on what are my goals? What are my goals? What am I trying to do? We lose focus on the bigger picture. And I think we get that tunnel vision. We're not really seeing a full picture. So I think it's important to kind of take time to zoom out and just maybe see what happens in that time, which I feel like is a very kind of like frou-frou, holistic-y response.
No, but it's legitimate. That's exactly, the time frame that it's time to do that right now. Yeah.
Well, and sometimes it's worth asking, what do I enjoy this? Or is there something, what do I enjoy?
Well, it really helps to stay motivated when you kind of look at things from another angle. And, like for those of us who haven't been able to get to the gym, since the COVID pandemic crisis, how can we get more out of online training? I mean, is there a way to improve our virtual online training experience? Do you have any suggestions around that?
I think it depends kind of. I will say I was blown away by kind of the fitness community and the amount of resources that they made available to the public. I thought it was amazing how many apps provided free services for people, or maybe the extended kind of like a free trial period. So there's definitely resources out there. I think it really depends on what works best for a given individual. With my work with Exos, I work with the Google account. So it's kind of my full-time position. And so we're constantly trying to find ways to make sure that people are staying connected, because a lot of times one of the reasons that people like going to a gym or they like going somewhere physical is that it kind of forces them to do it.
Yeah.
When you're at home all of the time and you have the same scenery and you're not necessarily financially investing in something, it's hard to stay motivated. So that's kind of a question that a lot of us within the fitness industry have been asking. And I think it really depends on the individual. Something that I'm exploring kind of on the corporate side right now is, is there a way to get people connected via GVC or like Zoom in some virtual way? Can we connect people to do like a group workout where it doesn't necessarily have to be everybody doing the same workout? Because for some people, that might be a little bit intimidating,
Sure.
And I know a lot of people, when they're going to some of our GVC-based classes, a lot of them turn their cameras off because they don't want to be seen. And one of the interesting things statistically that we've found during this time is that we have actually had more people participate in our corporate fitness program that never were involved during this time than we did when we were back in office. And a lot of that is because the work from home climate allows people to kind of work out from more of a safe place. It allows them to kind of put their toe in the water without feeling completely vulnerable and exposed and judged. And so it's actually increased participation, which is phenomenal. I think I would just encourage people to really explore all of the resources out there. There's tons of, personal training apps. There are YouTube videos for just about everything under the sun. On my Tag Performance YouTube channel, I've uploaded some recovery videos that you can kind of follow along with. Some of them are targeting the hamstrings or hip flexors if you have like chronic issues with a given area. But there's so many wonderful video resources. You can take like a Zumba class on YouTube. You could take a full yoga class on YouTube. There's strength training workouts, with no equipment, with some equipment, with resistance bands, all on YouTube. Different apps have things that are available. So I think it's really just about finding what works for you. But if you want some socialization, I would say maybe try to do something with a friend. So, Jill and Chris, you have each other. And so it's something wonderful where, one of my best friends and I, we message each other on Instagram if there's like some cool thing happening, like fitness related. Like she sends me all these like yoga at night or sunrise yoga things that are happening, and they're live Zoom events. And so you can kind of be in community with other people, but you can also turn off your camera if you kind of want to be anonymous. But things like that have a schedule that's outside of yourself, it helps with that accountability aspect. But then also including just a personal friend or maybe a family member can help with that accountability and making it more enjoyable as well.
That's good advice.
Yes. Sure is, yeah.
Let's talk about the flip side about that. So gyms, at least in places, are starting to reopen and people are starting to return to the gym. And what advice would you have for us if we haven't been working out to the same intensity for the past 4 months?
I'd say that's okay. I recently started going back into the gym, and to be completely transparent, I spent a lot of time not working out. like, like I'm a strength and conditioning coach, and I literally spent, months not really working out on a formal basis. I would do, a little bit, but I lost a ton of progress that I had. And my gym just opened up this week, to limited capacity with a lot of precautions. So my legs are still a little bit crushed from my workout on Monday, and it feels wonderful. But really, it's just like anything, wherever you're starting, you just want to push yourself a little bit harder. You just want to stimulate that adaptation. So it's really just about pushing your body outside of homeostasis. Maybe you don't do 4 sets of everything. Maybe you start with 2 sets. Maybe you don't start with a list of 10 different exercises. Maybe you start with a list of 3 to 5 exercises. Maybe you only go in once per week to get started. A lot of my Googlers, when they're new to GFit and they want to get started, they're like, okay, what should my plan be? And I'm like, the best plan is one you're going to stick to. When it comes to goal setting, I want it to be something that they can adhere to. And so I usually only recommend people have 1, maybe 2 goals to start. And so I'll set an initial week's goal, and I'll say, okay, you know what? Here's your goal for this week. Just try this class that you've been eyeballing. Or, you know what? Your goal is to come in every day and do 30 minutes of cardio before you come into work. Let's just try that for this week. Don't think about the upcoming weeks. Just think about this week. So really taking your goals and kind of making them into little bite-sized chunks. I think it can be very frustrating and almost a little demoralizing if people think, oh my gosh, it's been 3 months. I've lost all of my progress. I'm nowhere near where I was. And thinking about it in that terms, like let's take it more to the micro level. Let's think about, okay, what can I do this week that's more than what I did last week? And what's a reasonable goal? So maybe that's getting into the gym just twice. And also, if you haven't been working out, trying to go back to the gym every other day or even 3 days, it's probably going to be really uncomfortable, because if you're like me, you worked out on Monday and it's like 3 days later and you're still sore because your body hasn't been used to that much stimulus. So I think it's about making smart choices so that you don't take yourself kind of out for the week. So, just push yourself a little bit, whatever that is for you. Some people like me want to just go in and completely crush at a workout because it just feels so good and they've been craving it. You can do that. Know that you're probably going to be hurting and sore for like a number of days after, more so than usual. But if you want to kind of make it a little bit more of a comfortable toe back into the water process, I would say just push yourself a little bit more. Just get in for a single workout. Start with 2 sets of everything. Don't do a full workout if you're used to doing 6 to 8 movements. Start with 3 to 5, and then just slowly incrementally increase from there. And then every week, just reassess, from a weekly standpoint. Okay, what did I end up doing last week? How can I take that up a notch this week? Whether it's I'm going to go to the gym twice this week instead of once, or maybe it's instead of 4 exercises each workout, I'm going to do 5 this week. Or maybe instead of 2 sets, I feel ready to do 3 sets.
I'm sure there are plenty of people heading into the gym saying, well, I used to lift at this, so that's where I'm starting right back where I left off. So what I hear you saying is don't do that.
Well, it's discouraging too, if you try to do what you did before and then you've really taken 3 months off or what have you. If you try to start right back where you were, you're like, oh my gosh. So I like your idea of easing back into it a bit and building up, doing more than last week.
Exactly. And kind of one of the interesting things that, might be a fun tip, like let's say you like back squatting and you were back squatting 135 on the bar pretty easily. Well, maybe don't just go straight back to back squatting because you're going to be frustrated. And instead of feeling empowered, you're going to be like, oh man, I was back squatting 135. Now I'm struggling at 95. Right. And that's not really, that's ideally we want you to feel like at the end of a workout, we've set you up for a win in a sense, right? Like you've achieved something, not that you've lost something. So another strategy would be, you know what? If you spent all of this time back squatting, maybe when you go back into the gym, try something completely new because you don't necessarily have a baseline to compare it to say, oh man, I've lost all this progress. So maybe if you've never tried front squatting before, maybe try that for the first time, and maybe you'll start with the barbell, and that'll be enough stimulus for you because you've never done it before. But you also won't feel discouraged like, oh man, but my weight's gone down this much, because you know what? You've never done it before. So it's kind of a great opportunity for exploration too, because you are starting kind of not completely over, because your body does have muscle memory. And if you've built muscle, your body's going to be quick to build that back because you have been there before. But it's also a great time to kind of maybe try starting this climb from a different starting point and go from there, because also it'll give you different perspective. And we don't want to train in the same exact movement patterns all the time anyway. It might be kind of a good time to play around with some new variations, and it'll be kind of less psychologically defeating as well.
How do you define the word fit?
Oh gosh.
Not to put you on the spot or anything, but
oh, that's a really tricky question. And I feel like it's so relative too. When I think about fitness, I think about the ability to live one's best life, however you define that, and to live it freely without anything really like holding you back. So I think for me, it's about being ready. It goes back to that idea of constant readiness, which is kind of built into our philosophy in a sense. It's about being prepared. It's about being physically, mentally ready for anything in a sense. And that's a large part of what we stand for. We kind of have this motto, ready for anything. And to me, I think that's kind of how I don't want to say define, but how I would view fitness is that, you know what, you're in a ready state. You are prepared for anything that you might encounter, not to say the zombie apocalypse or anything completely crazy, but you know, you are physically, mentally, you are prepared for what it is that you want to undertake. And for some people that may be ultra running. For some people, that may be triathlons, sprint triathlons. For other people, that may be, just activities of daily life and playing with children, grandchildren. So to me, it's however you define that. It's being in that state of readiness. Like I am prepared. I am ready for anything that my life is going to throw my way.
All right, great. Thank you.
So let's switch gears to food. Do you recommend a specific diet for your athletes? Fueling for events is such a mystery. What advice do you give to athletes?
Oh, gosh.
I know. That's a big one.
Well, I feel like I'm always such a disappointment at times because I feel like people want these very specific answers and I'm kind of like, oh, it depends on the person.
Well, it does depend on the person, doesn't it?
Yeah. It does. But then I feel bad because I'm like, oh, gosh, that's not really like a good toolbox answer that people can kind of take and put in their pocket and say, yes, I know exactly what I need to do. So unfortunately, really, especially with nutrition, I really feel like there is not at all a one size fits all approach. And I think it's really about trusting your body, experimenting with a lot of different things. Like there are general guidelines that are important. As far as nutrition, are you thinking more like general nutrition or like performance nutrition?
More performance.
I tend to steer people towards whole foods, like real foods, especially in the endurance world. There's all these gels and different like things, like you can get salt tablets and different electrolyte tablets and powders and mixes and gels and waffles and little gooey things and chews. Right. And really it's sugar. And it's convenient and you can like stash it on your person. You can put it in like a drop bag pretty easily, but it's probably not the best nutrition. So in the same way that I think about training from that long-term athletic development model, it's not just about what's going to fuel you for this race, but it's kind of about thinking, what am I putting into my body? Just period, because it's something that's meant to sustain me, not just through this race, but it's something that I am physically taking into myself and that I'm using as the building blocks for my body. And so I really encourage people to stick with whole food sources as often as possible. That's not to say that, you can't eat a gummy bear on occasion. I certainly do that. But I think it's really just about focusing on real food for the most part. And then within that, you really have to find what works for you. I mean, I was adopted from Korea, and my brother actually got married in Japan. And so we went out there for his wedding for like 2 weeks, I want to say. And my stomach felt like I just felt the best I ever had. You know, in Japan, you walk everywhere for the most part, even though it's a city. But I really do think, and I have absolutely no research to prove this, so someone should absolutely do a study about this. But I do think that your genetics and kind of your heritage and your predecessors, you know, what they ate is literally what built me as a person. You know, those are the building blocks of who I am. And so I've noticed that certain foods sit well with me. It's not to say that I'm intolerant to certain foods or that I have a food allergy. I think there are just some types of food that I tend to do better with, or some types of, I don't want to say diet because I really don't diet. One of my best friends, she likes more of a Mediterranean style diet. I think a lot of times you have to think about your metabolic flexibility, because from a physiological standpoint, you're training your body to metabolize different fuel sources. So for me personally, I do not do well on a low carb diet. My performance is horrible. But so when you're thinking about performance, you also have to think about what sort of fuel does the sport require? Like, what energy systems am I tapping into? What have I trained my body to be efficient at metabolizing? So how can I support that? So a sprinter's diet is going to be very different than maybe an endurance athlete's diet, because of how they've trained their engine to metabolize fuels and what fuels, you know, they're able to metabolize on a given timeline. So there definitely is a science component. I think that there's a genetic kind of component to nutrition as well. Yeah, I would just say stick with whole foods, try to minimize the processed stuff, eat a variety. You know, they say eat the rainbow. It's kind of very common sense sort of knowledge, but, you know, pay attention to your body. If you've noticed that certain foods leave you feeling more bloated, your body isn't responding well, pay attention to that.
Good advice.
In May of this year, you released a newsletter. Well, actually, now I guess it's an e-magazine, because you ended up with 21 pages.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
So, but in that, you talked about a 3-day fast and fasting. How does fasting work with working out, and what are your experiences with fasting?
So for me personally, I really like intermittent fasting. And this is kind of just because it works well with my schedule. And also, I don't like being confined to eating like every 2 to 3 hours. You know, you get busy working and it's like, oh, I'm with an athlete right now, or I'm in a meeting. I can't necessarily just like eat. And when you're doing that, I feel like then you also have to plan to have a lot of processed things available to you if you are trying to eat more whole foods, right? As opposed to saying, okay, I'm going to eat 5 to 6 meals spread out throughout the day. You know, that doesn't work for everybody. It's not necessarily a lifestyle that fits everyone. So for me, I really like the intermittent fasting. Traditionally, when I'm in office, you know, I teach in the mornings at Metro. So I drive down to Denver. I teach on Tuesday, Thursday mornings, and then I come back up to Google. So I'm usually at Google from like 10 to 7, full-time Monday through Friday. And so at Google, they do provide, you know, breakfast, and they have lunch, and then they have like some snacks available throughout the office. And so really, breakfast is like my favorite meal of the day. And yeah, like I love breakfast food. I love brunch. I love everything associated with it. It's delicious. But I really feel like I need that energy to jumpstart my day. And for me personally, I'm just not as hungry as the day kind of dwindles. And I'm also not as active towards the end of the day. So for me, kind of front loading all of my food into the first half of the day, I give myself kind of like a 8-hour window of eating, and then I stop eating. You know, so I kind of, I eat what I need. I fuel myself within kind of an 8-hour window, and that kind of adjusts depending on, am I getting up early to teach down in Denver, versus am I coming into work at like 9 o'clock to get breakfast? So the exact times change, but it's a period of eating where I have 8 hours where I can kind of eat, and I don't actually track calories really. I just kind of eat with common sense. I, you know, usually eat a fuller breakfast, and then it kind of dwindles throughout the day. And then around 3 p.m., I'm done with eating, and I'm honestly just not even hungry for the rest of the day. And then I go home and I usually do some more work. I walk the pup, and then I go to sleep and I get ready to start my day all over again. So it's very convenient for my life, for kind of the times when I have access to food. It kind of cuts down on my grocery bill by eating at work and not having to meal prep and like buy all of these snacks myself. And It's much more convenient for me to say, okay, I can eat within this 8-hour period of time. I'll eat when I'm hungry. And I'm going to make sure that I've eaten enough to where I'm not hungry for a 16-hour window after that. But it gives my body time to actually work through everything that it's eaten. Because I think a lot of times with American culture, where everything is built around like food and drink, like all social gatherings are kind of built around food. Yeah. And so it's hard to like have a meeting where you're not going out for coffee or drinks or to hang out with a friend and not do dinner. To me, it's about stripping that away so that eating is not tied to certain behaviors or interactions throughout my day, to make sure that eating is kind of staying like a source of fueling. And I absolutely enjoy it. And I'm very present in those moments. I love breakfast and having that in the mornings and having that time to myself, but I've disconnected it from other things. And that works out well for me because I typically work out during the day. It'll be interesting to see how that changes kind of going back to work at some point in the future. But, you know, it was something that's very convenient for me. And I like having the time to actually work through a lot of the fuel that I've ingested, because a lot of times you just keep adding fuel. If you eat every 2 to 3 hours, you have to ask yourself, have I actually burned through all of the fuel that I've eaten previously to warrant eating again? And so what's nice about that fasting window is that it gives your body a period of time to fully reset and to work its way through everything that you've eaten before adding more fuel to the tank.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. Is there anything else that we haven't already discussed that you'd like to tell our listeners?
I don't think so. I'd really just kind of welcome any listeners to reach out. I definitely have a ton of resources that are available, but I'd say if you have questions that we didn't.
Where can they find you online?
That's a good question. I'm kind of all over the place. Instagram is definitely kind of a big place, so they can follow me. It's at Tag Performance CO, all spelled out. I have my website, which is Tag Performance CO for Colorado.com. So tagperformanceco.com. On there, you can have access to my Instagram page, my Facebook page, my YouTube channel. On the blog, I've also uploaded some of the YouTube videos, so that if you go onto the blog, you can actually just click on the graphics and it'll take you directly to some of the YouTube videos if you're interested in doing some more regen, mobility work. People can reach out to me on any of those platforms through my website. So yeah, I'd say if you have any questions and you want more specific information, just please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help.
Thank you. We'll put the links to those places in our show notes too, so people don't have to try and write it down right this minute. Thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been wonderful to hear your advice and insights.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I feel very privileged to be here, and I hope I can be of some help to your audience.
Thank you. You know, I know our listeners will really enjoy hearing what you have to say. Well, we look forward to talking with you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, Jess Elliott is just really motivating. I learned a lot.
This is just chock full of great information.
I'd really like to hear what our listeners think about endurance sports and adventuring. Let us know what you're doing.
Yes, and feel free to let us know what you thought of this episode. You can give us a call at 330-970-6662 and leave a message. Or if you'd rather type it, leave us a message on our website, becomingellie.com, or on the Facebook group page.
While you're at the website, be sure to subscribe for updates on all things Becoming Ellie. You can also find lots of great information and things to download there.
Besides the website, you can find us at Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you at whatever social media place you prefer.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can do that wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, tell your friends about us and show them how to access podcasts if you need to.
If you want, you could also leave us a review on iTunes. We sure to appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Join us for the next episode of Fit Strong Women Over 50.
Yes, see you next time. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.